Welcome to Finlos Loves. Eva co-hosts with me again, this time for a conversation about toxic masculinity. In doing so, we try to unpack what that term actually means in a time when gender roles, identities, and expectations are being challenged or broadened, depending on your perspective. This is a conversation that we hope you'll hear with an open mind, as it requires anyone engaging in these discussions to explore their own personal histories and identities. Toxicity is not a quality that belongs to any specific sex or gender, but instead represents a mindset that motivates behaviors that consciously or unconsciously maintain the status quo of power dynamics in any system. It is unfortunate that the beneficiaries of that status quo have historically been men or those who subscribe to or reinforce those behaviors. This conversation comes also at a time when Barbie, the recently released film, just crossed the $1 billion mark for global ticket sales and has garnered praise from many for advancing pro-feminist ideas. We'll get into that topic as well.
Hey.
So we saw Barbie yesterday, and we're totally going to have a spoilerific conversation about that at the end, so stick around.
Yeah. Yep. We have some not that important things to say about it. I don't know. We'll probably be echoing.
Don't sell us too short. Don't get people excited for what we're... It's not that important. You don't.
If you want to know what we have to say about Bobby.
About Bobby.
Bobby. Hey, Bobby. Our kid can't pronounce it. And so
Bobby.
We gotta go
say
Hi, Bobby.
Bobby.
Hi, Bobby. They spent, even though they didn't know anything about the movie, she specifically has spent weeks and weeks saying, Hey, Bobby.
Hey, Bobby.
Hey, Bobby.
But it was a very timely movie to see because we've been...
Yeah, geez, how long have I had this in the works, or
It's been over a month.
It's I wrote this in June, or I conceptualized some of the ideas.
So like a month and a half, almost 2 months.
Yeah, I mean we're about to start August, so yeah, yeah.
But thank you first of all for agreeing to continue these conversations that we've been having now for about a year.
Wow.
In the Finlos Loves conversations. Yeah, I think our first one that we did together was not too long after I started the actual podcast. So you're part and parcel of the whole project.
Yay! That's exciting. What a milestone.
Yeah. So thank you for agreeing to continue to have these conversations. It's super meaningful, and I value both your time and your input in your conversation. And so, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's fun. And I think it's important. And, I think we've talked about it a couple times. Like, it's like, are people really getting something out of this? I don't know. And really doesn't matter, because in the end, we're also getting something out of it. Right.
Of course, we've had the conversation about motivations and why we do this. Is this conversation really just for you and me? Because if it is, then why do we have to record it?
Right.
But obviously the intent is that we hope that people will listen to it and sort of use the lens of our conversation kind of housed in our experiences to hopefully get some insight and some, I don't want to say tips and their pointers for their own lives, but they can learn from what we've learned together.
Yeah. And do we want to ground in intention for today? Like,
sure.
So, we'll use different language throughout the conversation, but I think that what we want to center on today is the harm that comes from gendered socialization in our society, and particularly, I want to say the West, but the West isn't the only culprit of it at this point. With globalization, we have far-reaching impact, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but it comes with colonialism, right? Because a lot of it is based in Christianity and
So
some of the
exporting whiteness.
Yeah, Judeo-Christian religions. Exporting, packaging.
Yeah, packaging.
And capitalizing on.
Absolutely. There's no loaded language there at all.
No. And so I think for me, this is grounded in a lot of different conversations we've had over time about our own gendered upbringings, our own identities, as far as how we identify as well, right? So with I think you being particularly gender nonconforming and I being I don't know, but I don't know, like the term kind of like changes for me, but I think fluid, gender fluid or gender queer tends to fit best for me, and that how those really inform our politics and our viewpoints about everything.
Yeah. Yeah. And as rudimentary as it sounds, I do think it is important to just also ground, if we're going to be using these terms, just the reminder that gender is a social construct.
Yes.
And that's as differentiated from sex, which is biological. And the complication of, just in the last 5 years, let alone the last decade, how much the idea of even biological sex has been complicated because of research that shows the many variables that go into play in biological sex before we even start talking about what those genetics and the combination of genetics and experience and all of these things, how that goes into create the different gender identities that people can have, and how the interrelationship between gender and sex is just complicated, and there is no real one size fits all for anybody, I don't think.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think the conversation will center on like the idea of toxic binaries as a whole, but when we think about who has the power in society, we really can't ignore that toxic masculinity is really this big monster that's kind of leading and controlling the, and so maybe it makes sense to start there, like with what does that mean to you? What does toxic masculinity mean to you? And then obviously I can share what.
So I was actually thinking about this question as I was mowing the grass today, because I do a lot of good thinking and sort of those repetitive motions. And this is interesting because Naeem and I hope he doesn't mind me bringing him into the conversation. We were talking a few weeks or months back about the importance of good, positive role models, but it's specifically because he's a father of a son, positive male role models and healthy masculinity. And so we had an interesting conversation about what healthy masculinity is. And by the end of the conversation, I almost convinced myself that having as you're saying, the binary of masculine versus feminine is the root of the problem to begin with, because it forces the dichotomy or the split between sexes or genders that forces or encourages people to fall into these stereotypical roles. So by the end of it, we agreed that there is healthy masculinity and healthy femininity, although we weren't able to decide what those actual boundaries were. But I think toxic masculinity, if that was the question, like what do I think of it as, or how would I define it? I think that toxic masculinity is both a mindset. It's a mindset that enables behaviors which reinforce the supremacy of cis male and predominantly hetero, but also just cis male men in general.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's the mindset that there are inherent differences between male and female bodied people, that those inherent differences create or embody strengths and weaknesses, mostly strengths for men and weaknesses for women. And therefore, there are certain privileges and responsibilities that male-bodied people get to occupy, and certain responsibilities, and I don't know about privileges, but certain responsibilities that women occupy. However, on a more anthropological, mind you, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a sociologist. This is purely based upon what my experience as an educator, my experience in conversations that I've had with you as you discuss things with clients, things that I've read. I do believe that, and this is not an original idea, a lot of this actually comes from you. So I do want to say that, especially this language. But I think that toxic masculinity is housed in insecurity.
Yeah, and I mean it's you kind of like hit the nail on the head when you said that it's this kind of idea of like the diametric opposition of it is what it isn't versus what it is. Like I think we get, and you know, like you're just couching this also in like the fact that like a lot of this language, of course, comes from like originally from academia, and so for a long time, this is exactly the kind of thing that would have turned me off to having these kinds of conversations, just because it's like I can feel into the unfairness of situations. I can see the inequity of, you know, somebody getting to work all day, coming home, right? Like it's the difference between your white feminism versus being working class, which our families both were. And there was no division in that way, right? Both parents worked, you know, outside the home all day, but one came home and did additional labor at the end of the day, and the other one didn't necessarily, at least consistently. And so I think at its most basic, toxic masculinity refers to a rigid and narrow definition of the masculine as a binary and polar opposite of the feminine. Like that's just core basic definition. And it's usually characterized by a lot of different things, and we'll get more into the weeds of that, but definitely and primarily the suppression of emotions is one that's like really, really core to it. And so it's like this idea of stoicism. And so right there and then, like I can immediately call into mind tons of women who behave in that same way, like who are very stoic, who are, including my own mom, right? Like my mom definitely had periods of stoicism, and you know, maybe it was because she identified most closely with her dad, and so maybe she, and you know, sort of integrated some of those characteristics into her personality. But stoicism, maintaining an appearance and reputation for just toughness, right? Like don't mess with me. If you do, something bad's going to happen to you, kind of thing. And using, and I think this is what really originally drew me to the concept, but using violence as an indicator of power. And that always includes violence against women and children specifically, right? So, and when we say children, we have to remember, like, obviously, like half the children are not girls, right? Like they're not necessarily femmes, they're boys. So at the root of this, like, false, like socially constructed concept is just harm, inherently harm. And I think that's what originally like kind of drew me to that concept. And a couple of years ago, I know you didn't have the opportunity to read it, but we read Nora Samaran's the opposite of rape culture is nurturance culture. And there were some things in there that just like, I don't know, they just really resonated. And it was one of those books where I was like, if I wish that every person who's been socialized as male, whether they are, whether they identify with that label or not, would just read this, because it gives voice to so many of the, and it's really a primer, but like it gives voice to so many of the issues that you kind of see down the road as like in the ways that we struggle as adults to connect and to, anything from like creating friendships, sustaining relationships, feeling, connected not just to like our partners, but even like our children as our children get older, right? Because our children can be fairly easy when they're, and I say fairly easy, like, oh yeah, they're never really easy, but it's easier when they're young and you just know that you can just play with them. You can just toss them in the air and they're happy and they're giggly and but as they, especially if you do have, children who are growing up as female and they start to like go through all these changes that you can't really feel connected to because you don't know what those changes feel like. There's like this growing separation that kind of starts to build over time. And you're just like, okay, well, how do I bridge that gap? And like often, a lot of, and not always, right? Like I love those parents who are like, I picked up pads and like, whatever, like all the different menstruation, like, hygiene materials needed for the entire whole household, and that's cool. But there are still those fathers or those parents who are very much like, not me. I don't want to talk. I don't want to talk about periods. I don't want to know anything about him.
Yep.
And so all of that just kind of like that huge separation. And so I think that it's also toxic masculinity is often also referred to as traditional masculinity, or for me, and I don't know if you ever grew up with the term at all, but like in Latino culture, it's also known as machismo, and it does have a different flavor when it's machismo.
Yeah, I'd never, that specific language wasn't used, but equally problematic and harmful language was definitely used. The one that comes to mind is Mama's Boy, where which is the opposite, right? Where I'm if I'm embodying behaviors or displaying behaviors or attitudes that are perceived as feminine, which I was called many times, and so I think that and what comes with that then is shame, right? If you ever display behaviors that are unmasculine, then traditional masculine, I should say, behaviors that are not traditionally masculine, then the only thing that can come from that is shame. There is no way that that's normal or acceptable. And so, yeah, I think the opposite is just as effective as what you're saying.
Yeah, and the female equivalent of that would be Marianismo, which is aptly named for usually for those who maybe are not as familiar, like La Virgen Maria or the Virgin Mary, and so Marianismo comes directly from that terminology, and so there tends to be a very Christian and particularly Catholic, because in a lot of Catholic traditions, particularly in South Central America and in the Caribbean, as kind of a way to resist colonialism, there was a lot of goddess practice before colonialism that only survived by sort of becoming cults of Mary. And so the cults of Mary are actually, when we really look at them, quite inspiring to kind of think like we took this concept of, and the one that comes to mind, and I feel like I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but Tonantzin, the goddess, she was very highly worshipped in a lot of different parts of Mexico, and so I think that one thing that Catholics were really smart about was like, oh, okay, you practice like, goddess worship, your main deity. We have a deity like that, like Mary, and sure, like she's relegated to like this like just human counterpart to like basically a vessel, which again, that's kind of the concept of Marianismo, right? That women are just simple vessels. And so, but I think both Marianismo and other gender roles for femmes are, obviously constructed by those who have sway or power in society. And so it makes sense that that's what we would get. We would get to be vessels in this. And so women get relegated to further in that like sort of binary system, and which is what's really fascinating. And I think later when we talk about Barbie, we can kind of maybe talk about that a little bit. I don't know how much we'll actually want to dig into a movie that in the end wasn't really that deep, but I mean, I'm just saying, but there is this Madonna horror complex, right? And so it's called the Madonna horror complex, but I think there's another term for it, which is the Madonna mistress complex.
Mm-hmm.
And even though the concept itself is much older, like I can think back to Roman times and, the idea of having brothels and having lots of sex outside of your arranged marriage or, whatever, your legal marriage. So that was a concept that was very alive and well, even back in those times, pre-Christian times. However, the term itself came from Freud, when Freud was kind of trying to name this idea of why men had difficulty accessing and being excited about continuing sexual relationships with people that they were married to, that they were partnered with legally, because they often didn't want to. And so then they sought sex outside of, usually by either, sex workers or from mistresses. It's the idea that we think that there's this simple binary, but it's a lie. Even that's a lie, because then that binary, within the binary of like, oh, well, either you're like this strong masculine person, or you're like or you're a femme. But then within that, men were kind of like, oh, no, but then you can be two types of women. So we're going to further create this binary that not only keeps women kind of fighting each other, right? Because it does create this kind of like sense of like, well, you're just the mistress or you're just the wife, the wives versus the...
Right.
And I think that comes up a lot in like The Handmaid's Tale, for example,
for sure.
Like the idea of like the Jezebels and the wives versus the breeder, the breeder handmaids and that kind of thing. But that's exactly what this does, is that it, even within that binary, if you don't adhere perfectly to whatever standard, so that's when you create this Marianismo, or what can also be referred to as toxic femininity. And the point of that is to say that in a system like that, either extreme, right, that femmes receive conditional value in that patriarchal society. So either your value is that you're kind of like somewhat safe and protected through economic means, because you're technically property, but if anything were to happen to you and you were married, you might be better protected than somebody who isn't.
Right. But
if you're not married, you have a level of autonomy that you don't have if you are married, so it's trade-offs.
And on the reverse of that, on you're highlighting a lot of inherent sort of hypocrisies in these ideas of what would be called traditional, right?
Right.
So you have the traditional binary, which is the paired man and woman, the married couple, the legal long-term relationship, whatever the terminology is that you want to use. And the argument, as you just said, being, it's security for the woman because you are financially stable from the man who is doing the work and making the money with whatever the economic relationship would be, with then the expectation, or at least the cultural expectation is that that is a sacred, secure thing. But the reality is that in many cultures, there's an understanding that, yes, as long as the man is providing security and finance, that there's a certain, and this is an aspect of toxic masculinity that I again, we keep foreshadowing the Barbie talk, but the idea of men getting to play. And that is one of the foundations of toxic masculinity, is the understanding that these dynamics are in place to allow for play to happen for men. And that play is an expectation, whether that be, as you're describing these sexual pursuits outside of the foundational or the primary relationship. But then the other irony, which is also what you're alluding to, being that the masculine person will seek the harlot, right? The easy or whatever negative terminology that you want to use for that relationship. But then that woman is a shunned person in society.
Yeah. And it can be a man too.
Or man.
Yeah.
Right. But that person is shunned, but not the man who's seeking the relationship.
Right. Yes.
Right. It's not a transmittable shame in that situation.
Yes.
But the wife, what's the Spanish word again for not marido, but what is it when you're engaged? What's the
engaged is prometida, but married is casada.
Casada, it is married. Yeah, which the root word being their house. Casa.
Yeah, she's housed.
She's housed. So she does not have the same freedom
exactly
to play or to seek pleasure outside of the confines of the relationship.
Right. Yeah, because she's the characteristics of toxic femininity include being self-sacrificing, include being doting, being subservient, being wife material.
Right.
Like, yeah.
And even within the house, even within the relationship, yes, it is an inherently sexual relationship because it's intended to reproduce,
produce children. Yeah.
But she's not. She is somewhat not chaste, but
like vanilla.
yes.
She's vanilla.
That's a good word for it. Yes.
She can't be too freaky.
That's
for the mistresses.
Because then she's too much like the mistresses.
Yes.
Right. So, but then right. But if she does, but then the man gets bored and wants not vanilla, wants some chocolate, or wants some cookies and cream, or whatever.
Whatever.
And sorry, that was all problematic. Want something else.
We're talking about flavors.
Flavors, yes. Want something else. So the woman tries to do it, and immediately says, "Where did you learn how to do that? Why do you do this? Where does this experience come from?" Right. And heavens forbid that she have a life before this person,
right?
Or that she talked to other women who have experiences,
or that she's exploring, like learning it, like even through, like, oh, God forbid she's watching porn. Or
but again, it comes back to one of the, if not the foundational quality of toxic masculinity, which is insecurity.
Yep.
And everything then becomes a threat. Other men are threats.
Yes.
Other women are threats.
Yeah. Get controlling behaviors.
Yeah. Can I ask you, because you were talking about machismo and the gendered sort of ideas of what these traditions are, traditional masculinity, traditional femininity. Is it inherently toxic to have those binary differences? Are there truly feminine qualities or truly masculine qualities, or are these just social constructs that we've made?
Yeah, I genuinely think that they're social constructs, because as you were discussing the concept of, like, okay, well, what do good examples of healthy masculinity or healthy femininity look like, even that, like it kind of like I kind of got a little like, I was like, well, yeah, surely there are. And then as I was thinking about it, I was like, okay, well, what are things that I would consider good qualities of a healthy masculinity? And they would be things like leadership. And I'm like, well, shit, women can be leaders. And I was thinking, well, it can be protectiveness, like protecting your family. And I'm like, women protect their families. In fact, there are so many single women who constantly protect their families, are the ones making the bacon, all that. And likewise, like, I think when I tried to do the opposite, I actually had more trouble thinking about, like, okay, can men be nurturing? And I'm like, yes, it kind of lacks the same depth, unfortunately, which is problematic and inherently one of the problems with toxic masculinity that we'll talk about, because that's by design. And so it's one of the things where it's not that they don't want to have these deep and connected relationships, but generally what happens, or what I've observed happens, at least in my own limited, scope of like practice and like with clients and with even just thinking about my grandfather, is if it happens at all, it doesn't happen until men age, until they start to kind of like really start to, I don't know how to say it like really well, but like reevaluate where they are in life and why they're there. And I think it definitely also, culture also matters a lot. So I think that there are cultural contexts in which like men have always been able to have friendships in a different way, that they're able to have relationships with their kids that are definitely more emotionally grounded. And that's not always the case in these cultures that we're mostly a part of now. But I think I saw something recently that talked about like the things that your Latino dad or your papi does to show you care, and it was things like wash your car and like and I'm like, you know what, like that's an act of service. Like I would love for people to watch. I do actually. I appreciate people washing my car, so that would actually be part of my language. But again, like I don't identify as like a hyper feminine individual. So for somebody else, like that might be like, nah, like, I wanted a gift or whatever. And I'm like, okay, well, what part of that supposed love language? And there are problematic aspects to the love languages, like the 5 love languages thing, as, that come from like places like capitalism and that don't take things like poverty into the equation. I mean, like, because if to you a gift, like if you can't receive like a rock and see that as a gift, a regular rock or like a semi-precious rock or something like that, right? What you're expecting as a gift, it tends to be something of like more monetary value. Then are gifts really the love language, or have you attached some sort of like capitalistic meaning to what gift giving is, right? Because to me, like, gifts can be those acts of services. To me, gifts can be conversations, can be all kinds of things. And so, but then again, that's like time together. And so there's just like, again, like this constant need for us to create these weird binary, like, even out of like the behaviors that we engage in and how we show love.
Delineated, demarcated, sort of divided things. Yeah,
like just you want to have categories so that you can like check boxes and like be like, okay, did I do a good job with this? Or
right.
It's helpful. It's helpful for making sure that you're showing people appreciation in the ways that they want to be shown appreciation, but it doesn't mean that appreciation came from like necessarily a healthy place, or from a grounded place. That if they had been raised a different way, maybe they would appreciate other things more. And that so much of what we think of as important or that we value actually is harmful. Even just thinking about like climate crisis stuff, which I think is actually one of the main concerns with things like Mattel making this big like Barbie movie, right? Like the idea of like, okay, yeah, let's just throw caution to the wind and like not worry about all the ills in the world and like just you know, just engage in like this frivolous, like, you know, and yes, sometimes you have to, sometimes, but isn't it worthwhile to do that with things that actually bring you joy versus things that feel kind of like silly and frivolous, like that don't seem to matter quite as much. And yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but
I mean, I think so, and I tend to agree with you that I think the constant need to label things is a way of creating markers of success that are simple.
yeah,
Right. So if we have a boy, here's the list of boy qualities. Like we have a male child, we want him to be strong and assertive and dominant and clever. And if we have a girl child, we want her to be docile and kind and
Yes.
comforting and nurture. And therefore we have these checklists that we can look at our children and say, we are successful, right? So I think from a like an acculturation, from a sort of how we raise our children, it makes it easy to sort of have these binaries, and then we create the toys which reinforce them.
yeah,
And so you have the fire engines, and you have the police officers, and you have the army GI Joes, and then you have the baby dolls, and then you have the house, and then you have all of the right, because
Yeah.
it reinforces those roles, which again are simply, they're just easy. I think really what it makes things a lot easier. But I think easy isn't right, and I think it's an oversimplification of the complexity of the needs of everybody. Because I think, at least in my experience as a person who was definitely socialized traditionally male and who has struggled against it and been told that I was behaving in ways that were unmasculine, that it's hard because you take to heart those things that are labeled weaknesses, and you do exactly what you described, stoic. Like you become stoic. You shove it down. And even if it's not true to your nature, even if you're not a violent person by nature, the only thing that can come from the pressure cooker of emotions is that you erupt and you do harm and you become violent, or whether it's violence with words or violence with physical violence. Like you end up embodying the exact thing that you don't want to.
yeah,
And so I think that there is risk, and I think it's helpful. I think it simplifies things to be able to say, if your body conforms to these things, life will be easier for you if you embody these qualities. I think that there's a sense to that. I think it's wrong,
yeah.
but I can see where that comes from. And again, this is all contingent upon living in a in a still colonial capitalistic world where so much of our time is spent being productive. And so all of these things are intertwined with one another. You can't talk about toxic masculinity without talking about capitalism, without talking about race, and without talking about gender, and without talking about all of these problems that are related to each other, which is why I think there is potential for, if not harm, at least like greatly oversimplifying the nuances of these conversations when you have a product like a Barbie movie,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is kind of like you said, it's not that deep.
Yeah. I just, yeah.
So I think that I don't want to sound as if I'm actually defending the ideas of traditional masculine and feminine, because I'm not. I think that having those binaries are problematic, but I am trying to understand where they come from. And the question that you ask as a therapist, and I think it's a great question, is how are you benefiting from this behavior? If we have identified this behavior as a problem, we see it, we know it's a problem, right?
Yeah.
We know that it's a problem, that we're raising people to fall into these ruts, these harmful intergenerational traumatic behavioral patterns. Yet why do we keep doing it? Like, what is the benefit? So I'm trying to understand that. I really am. And are we just lazy? Are we? Is it just easier to go along with it?
Yeah, I don't know. I that's the big question, right? Because it's the thing that we say is that it's not just hurting, like, yeah, it doesn't just hurt like femmes, right? Like we were implying earlier, like if this violence is turned on all our children, right? There are certainly children who identify as, non-binary and anywhere in between, and like anywhere in between in terms of like the spectrum of where they might. And also it just like severely limits. Like I feel like anytime that you limit people to any one box, right? And I think that's also, again, like a reference to the movie, like the idea of being in boxes, like, oh, you fit in this box and you are stereotypical Barbie, you are weird Barbie, you are whatever Barbie you are, right? Or Ken. There were no non-binary Barbies, by the way, just FYI. So I don't know what to do with that. But yeah, so we know that it's a huge part of really one of the core elements of violence in our societies. And the characteristics are violence, dominance, emotional illiteracy, which I really want to zero in on that one. We've already started to talk about it, right? Like, what does it look like to literally not know how to deal with your own emotions? Because if you lack that self-awareness, there's no way you're being set up for failure, because you can't possibly understand the emotions of other people if you can't even understand your own. Sexual entitlement, which, let me tell you, does not go well with emotional illiteracy when it comes to like, being able to be in relationship with people, and hostility to anything that looks the opposite or looks different from that model of masculinity, which tends to be hostility towards what's considered feminine. And I think that perhaps one of the best examples, like current examples of this playing out, is the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which is a complex but real example, right, of like the Madonna whore complex. The idea that married women should obviously want to be mothers, right? And as long as you're doing it in within a loving relationship, you would be deserving of health access and care. Like worst case scenario, like you wanted your pregnancy or it was a surprise, and like you're spontaneously having a miscarriage, or what we say is spontaneous abortion. And in that case, like, of course, we want to help you. And of course, you should get to not die. So we've at least reached the point in our society where it's not nice to let women just die from childbirth. Wonderful. Like that, I mean, milestones, right? Like baby steps.
I don't know. There's a couple of states that are even pushing back. It's like there are no exceptions.
No exception.
No
exceptions. Well,
exceptions.
there you go. And Florida, for the record, the original 15-week ban, which is what's actually holding up the more stringent 6-week ban, actually includes no rape exceptions either. And so like that's what we've come to. And so, yeah, it's that, or you are undeserving, right? Because you had sex out of wedlock, you didn't use protection, you didn't think to.
Wait, protection's not allowed though, right? Because
No, because God forbid somebody have to put on a condom, and sex not be as pleasurable for them.
For the men? Who?
Yeah, for the non-vagina owner.
Right. Yeah. For the penis owners.
Because vaginas feel it just fine. So
I think you inadvertently actually I think answered the big question. So the three things that you were describing as being really integral to toxic masculinity is emotional. What did you call it?
So there were a couple, but like violence, domination, emotional illiteracy,
and then sexual entitlement,
and hostility to femininity.
So I think that those the beneficiaries could only be men in that situation, right? So that is, you keep empowering. It's a system, and this is obviously just the obvious.
Yeah,
it empowers those people, right? Because if you're entitled to these bodies for both pleasure and for emotional support, because you can't tend to your own emotions.
Yes.
So you need a feminine partner to groom your emotions for you. Mm-hmm. And if they don't, then of course you're entitled to punish them. Like,
right.
The only beneficiary, there is a single beneficiary in that equation, right? There's nothing good there.
Yeah.
For women or female or femfolk.
Yeah, and I mean, even when there are avenues for doing that work, like we know, for example, if folks really wanted to do the work, there are avenues like mental health avenues, therapy and such, but only 5% of men even seek outpatient mental health care. So I mean, like,
because there's nothing wrong with being a man.
No, there's nothing. There's nothing wrong with
what do you mean?
I
need to see a therapist because I want to have sex and because I expect my wife to like take care of. Why? What?
Yeah, right.
That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So with clients that I've had who are trans or who identify as trans masculine or trans feminine, one of the things that we see is that because they have never been allowed to be who they were, that when they first start to really try to embody who they are, what results is sort of like a caricature of femininity or a caricature of masculinity, and that inadvertently often harm is created in some way. Sometimes there isn't harm, but it can look like a performance from the outside, because it can sort of look like, oh man, like this person, and especially when they're an adult and they're sort of experiencing this for the first time, it might almost be like watching and this is not to infantilize, so I hope I'm really grounding and like trusting that our viewers will have grace, that it's almost like an adolescent, right? Like that's the stage of development at which we're supposed to be doing the majority of our exploration and figuring out who we are. But if we never got to do that, then often we are doing it in our adulthood. Mm-hmm. And because we're doing it in our adulthood, it can come across as very awkward and like fake, almost like a performance. Yeah.
I just said like a caricature
yes.
or a stereotype.
Yes. And then in addition to that, because you're so, maybe it's excitement, maybe it's just like putting on, it's almost like putting on a costume. So at that point, sometimes these actually really harmful masculine behaviors or feminine behaviors can be wielded in a way that actually causes harm to people in their lives. And so often in therapy, they are coming to terms with that, coming to terms with the harm that came from like how rough that transition was. And so again, like here's another way that these false binaries end up really hurting people, and not just the people who couldn't just freaking be who they are, but the people in their lives, and then causing this sort of cascade of issues that then have to be dealt with as trauma.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's something that it gets, again, for a lot of people, I think, unfortunately, their initial exposures and experiences to, I guess we'll call them non-traditional relationships, right, mm-hmm. is through media. And I think it is something that is a stereotype that is unfortunate because it does happen. But even in same-sex couples, you'll have one partner embodying the traditionally male and the other partner embodying the traditionally female roles. And it's really interesting how those dynamics still play out, even in a situation when you would think that because that pressure has been removed, because there isn't the traditional cultural pressure of the male-female relationship, that somehow would alleviate the toxic aspects, but yet
right, like in same-sex couple. Oh yes, oh my god, like the difficulty with like I think there was an article that came out quite a while ago about like power butch women, particularly, but like the violence that came along with those identifications, in much the same way that it happens with men, right? And so yes, absolutely.
Crazy. I'm not
right.
crazy. Not crazy.
Yeah, not crazy.
It's acculturation, and it's and how we learn to act.
Right. And then there's like with then there's this added pressure or idea of like what passing looks like, right? Because there's safety in passing. If you can pass, then you can just be you. You can just be who you are. Whereas if it's obvious that you are trans, that comes with that violence that we talked about, right? And you're often a target for violence, and so it's it's like it's heartbreak. It's heartbreak over and over and over again for everyone, but even more so for the people who are on the receiving end of that violence, because we're also left powerless and powerless in like the very real sense, not in the sense of like we don't have any power to heal from the things that happen, because ultimately these are just things that happen to us that don't have to define us, but that's easy to say. And sometimes if you're stuck in a situation where that harm is chronic and continuing and you don't know when you're going to get out of it, then yeah, it can seem hopeless, and it can lead to you taking, really rash measures, whatever those may be.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. The next part of this discussion about toxic masculinity will be released soon. If you have comments, questions, or feedback, we'd love to add your voice to the conversation. You can contribute via social media, send an email to finlos@finloslives.com, or leave a message via the SpeakPipe app on the website, finloslives.com. If you like this episode or any of the Finlos Lives content, I hope you'll share it. I look forward to our next conversation.